Boston Freedom Trail 2026. I parked in Revere Beach, north of the harbor, and took the subway down to Boston Common. And that's where you start the Freedom Trail. And the trail is about 2.5 miles long. I ended up walking about 7 miles that day. Just kind of going in circles. But um, here's a list of all the different sites on the Freedom Trail, and I saw a few more as well. Boston Common, established in 1660, it was in public use as early as 1630, grazing cattle. It was part of a giant estate. The owner died, and Boston took the land. Um, but it is the oldest public park in the United States, covers 50 acres. It's full of monuments, most notable being the Civil War Monument and Colonel Shaw's Monument. Here's a aerial view of Boston Common. That concrete area to the right is a ice skating rink. Uh, The Boston Soldiers and Sailors Monument, dedicated to the armed forces members from Boston who fought in the Civil War, not just those who died, but everyone who fought. And off to the left, what you can't see, there's actually a smaller monument to the nurses of the Civil War. This is the plaque for the Robert Shaw Monument. Uh, the 54th Regiment was the first African American fighting regiment in the United States, commanded by Robert Shaw, immortalized in pop culture by the movie Glory. Great movie if you haven't seen it. Great cast. They suffered catastrophic losses assaulting Fort Wagner in 1863. At the back of the monument, showing the white officers and black soldiers who died. The front of the monument with uh, a sculpture of Robert Shaw himself. Massachusetts State House is just in front of this monument. It's been in continuous use since its initial construction. It's not the first Massachusetts State House, but it's the one in current use. The white buildings are additions, and the brick structure is the original State House. The dome on top was originally wood, and it rotted and fell, and was replaced with a gilded brass dome. Park Street Church. This is the was considered the first congregation, um, as opposed to the second and third congregations, which we'll talk about in a minute. Still in use as a church. This congregation was loyal to the British, so other congregations popped up for revolutionaries. The Granary Burial Ground, on the grounds of a granary, obviously. It has Paul Revere, all five victims of the Boston Massacre, and three signers of the Declaration of Independence. So these informational plaques are everywhere. They're really hard to read in a picture, but I took a few pictures of them. I had 6 hours to see everything. You could really spend 2 to 3 days on this trail. Every one of these has tours and guides, and I just didn't have that kind of time. King's Chapel Burial Ground. It has most of the original governors of Massachusetts, including the very first governor, um, governor died in 1649. He actually has a tomb on the grounds. William Dawes Jr. was one of the Midnight Riders, who warned the revolutionaries that the British were coming after seeing the lanterns lit in the Old North Church. The Old Corner Bookstore, Boston's oldest commercial retail establishment, unfortunately was under renovation. It was almost torn down in 1960, but it was preserved. It's currently being renovated. We'll have a Chipotle in it. The tenancy after renovation will help to fund the preservation of other historic structures in the city. So, how did revolutionaries communicate with each other long before the age of cell phones, right? They used an ancient device allowing them to speak to someone many miles away. Some are still preserved today on random street corners. The Old North Meeting House. This is the organizational headquarters of the Boston Tea Party. It was a church, but it also served as a town meeting hall. It's much larger than it looks. It could hold 5,000 people. This was the third congregation. This congregation was loyal to the United States Revolution versus being loyal to the British. The British occupied and gutted the church for its participation in the revolutionary cause in 1775. It was turned into a horse training stable inside. It was then uh, um, repaired in 1846. The old State House. I think I may have called that the North Meeting House. It's the South Meeting House. Anyway, Old State House. This was the original State House. It's the city's oldest public service building. It was the tallest structure in Boston until 1745. This building housed the government until the new State House was erected in 1798. I need to fix some spelling there. It's also the site of the Boston Massacre in 1770, the shot heard round the world. After the massacre, the people of Boston rioted, forcing the British to evacuate until their return in 1775. This is a duck. It was driving by. They were used as amphibious landing craft in World War II. Now they take tourists on driving tours around the city. Faneuil Hall, built in 1742. It's called the Cradle of Liberty. It served as the site of many public speeches inciting citizens to revolt against the British. Statue of Samuel Adams. Um, he was considered more famous than his cousin, John Adams. He was a prolific writer of political letters and speeches. The statue is located in what was formerly known as Adams Plaza, but it's now the Faneuil Hall Historic Plaza. How do you start a revolution? First, you have to get drunk, right? So they all drank at the Green Dragon Tavern, first established in 1705. Called the headquarters of the revolution. The basements is where the famous revolutionaries sat to discuss their secret plot to oust the British and lubricate themselves before walking over to the Faneuil Hall to speak. Uh, in its current location, uh, it is next to the Union Oyster House, considered the oldest continuously operating restaurant in the United States. It was an establishment that was focused on food with drinks, right? Versus the taverns that served alcohol and they served food just to sober you up. The Bell and Hand Tavern would be considered the oldest continuously operating bar in the United States, except for its closure during the Prohibition. On the left, we've got the Union Oyster House, a favorite of the Kennedys, and the Bell and Hand Tavern right next door. And then across the street, we have the Green Dragon Tavern, headquarters of the Revolution. And then this is the original Green Dragon Tavern. That building was torn down in I believe it was in 1784, um, and then relocated on the different place on Union Street. This is Union Street, um, home of the Green Dragon Tavern, still paved with its original cobblestones. Its oldest street still to have its cobblestones. Vehicles traffic is it's still allowed. CDOT can learn a few things from this. There was no potholes. There's no sinkage. It's still functioning just fine. Paul Revere's house, built in 1680. He wasn't the first resident, obviously not the last, but he owned this house from 1770 to 1800 during the Revolution. Raised 16 children from two wives. Five died as infants. First wife also passed. It's thought that only 5 to 6 children lived with him at any one time. Others were grown with families of their own. Only five of the children actually outlived their father. The house is furnished with original items owned by the Revere family, donated by his descendants. The house is 3 stories tall, plus it has a basement. In the basement is the original kitchen, which was just a giant fireplace that you would hang things over. Paul had a more modern kitchen installed when he bought it. Photographs are not allowed inside, but I snapped a few sneaky ones. The bed shown is hinged. to allow it to fold out of the way for more living space. It has a very unique uh, mechanism I'll talk about in a second. Kitchen has a floor-mounted broiler and a brick oven used for baking. There's the plaque outside, and this is the view from the street before you go through the courtyard. Here's the view from the courtyard. The third story is an attic space, but it houses two bedrooms. This is the kitchen Paul Revere had installed. Notice the broiler in front. It's open on the back. You put your meat in there and then turn that crank, and broil your chicken or your turkey or your goose. On the left, you'll see a square hole with a loaf of bread and a wooden door. You would light a fire in there, then shovel out your ashes, and then the fire on the right would keep it warm while you plugged it up with that wooden door and baked your bread. This is Paul Revere's bed. So again, I told you it was hinged. It had ropes on cams, and so the ropes would help you lift the bed because they were under tension on this cam. And then once it was in its upright position, the ropes would hold it there in place as well. The ropes would stretch, and that weird looking wooden device on the table on the left is the tool that you would use to tension those ropes. The Old North Church, one if by land, two if by sea. It's the oldest standing church in the city. It is in this tower that two lanterns were hung to alert revolutionaries that the British were coming by sea, spawning Paul Revere's Midnight Ride and cementing him in American history forever. It is still an active church. Unfortunately, it was undergoing renovation and not open to the public at the time. So here we have the Paul Revere statue, and that's the Old North Church in the background. Quite tall, actually. Copp's Hill Burying Ground, second oldest cemetery in Boston in 1659. The hill it sits on was originally 10 feet taller. The dirt was relocated to fill in the old mill pond to expand into the harbor. Most of the harbor area was marshy, and they needed firmer ground. And they were trying to uh, eradicate mosquitoes. The oldest stones in the cemetery are those of William Copp's children, aged 1 and 3 when they died in 1661. As was the custom, they were buried in the same plot, and the stones were stacked together against each other. These are the stones of Copp's two children, just randomly sticking up out of some pavers. It was very strange. The Bunker Hill Memorial, very large. I did run out of time after the Constitution, so I did not get to go to the park, but it was so large I could see it from half a mile off. It was erected to memorialize the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17th, 1775. So those are the two pictures I took. And then this one's here's the Boston Harbor from I was walking across the bridge to the USS Constitution in the Naval Yard. Freedom Trail signs are all along the trail just to let you know that you're still on the right path. Here was my lunch. Can't go to Boston without having a bowl of clam chowder, right? And that beer behind my bowl is a liter, and I had two of them. And this is what I really went to Boston to see, was the USS Constitution. It's one of six identical frigates commissioned by the United States and designed by shipbuilder Joshua Humphreys. The six frigates were built in six port cities simultaneously. The Constitution was built in Boston. It cost about $300,000 at the time. Her design was revolutionary. While most British frigates were 28, 32, or 36 guns, and they were armed with 12 or 18 pounders, signifying the weight of the ball instead of by caliber. The Constitution was a 44 gun frigate, and armed with 24 pounders. She could take on any frigate she encountered, and she had overwhelming firepower, and she could outrun anything larger like ships of the line, which were the only other ships that could carry guns of a similar size. Her structure finally cured the age-old problem of hogging, where a ship would sag fore and aft from the weight of cabins, cable tiers, making the keel look like a hog back. The deep um, bow would sink in and displace water, but then the hog-backed keel would create vacuum and cavitation, suck water back up, and then the stern had to push that water back out of the way again, slowing down the ship. Using diagonal bracing, they managed to keep the keel straight, which made her very fast. She's the oldest sailing ship still afloat and has been continuously in commission as a warship since her launch. She has a full-time Navy crew and sails multiple times a year to salute Fort Wagner and train Navy crews. She's even been on cruises around the world. This is the engine house. It was built in 1833, originally constructed to house the steam engines that pumped water from the dry dock used for Constitution's repairs. First time being in 1833. She was 35 years old at the time. It now serves as the Constitution Museum. The old Ironsides in dry dock. Dock number one. Built in 1833, at the time of its construction, this was the largest and most expensive civil engineering project the U.S. had ever undertaken, costing $1.5 million. It is now just preserved, it's not in use anymore, but it's still dry in there, which means that those locks at the far end are still working. Here's the three masts of the Constitution. So these were very large guns compared to other ships. So when we think about the port lids, you would think about a solid door, and you pull the cannon in, and then you close the door, and you would, smooth ship sides. Well, these were so big that the tips would stick out, so that they could still have room to move around inside. That's why they had these double port lids, and with the hole in the center for the muzzles to stick out. These are the main chains, and these are where we anchor the masts, and we do them outside of the bulwarks to keep the ropes from crowding the deck. This is also where you hook on ship's boats as you come alongside, and this is where the boarders would stand in battle to jump onto the enemy ship. So on the left we have the foremast, that's the mast in the front. On the right we have the mainmast, that's your main mast in the center of the ship. And on the left here, we have the mizzen mast, which would be the rear mast of the ship. Now, that platform up on top, people call that a crow's nest, but on a warship, it is not a crow's nest. It is called the fighting top. And that is where Marines would lay and snipe the officers on the enemy's quarterdeck. Or they would shoot into the boarders getting ready to board your ship. This is also where the lookouts would be while they were sailing. On the right, we have the captain's skylight. This would let air into the captain's cabin. He could also hear what was going on deck. If a ship was sighted, he could hear the lookout yelling down. So most people would call this a cannon, but it's not a cannon. It is an iron tube that shoots a ball with gunpowder, but because it's on a ship, it's called a gun. And in this one in particular is very stubby. This shot a 32-pound ball. It is called a carronade. And that wedge you see with the handle on it on the backside was called the coin because originally it was a giant wooden disc that you would put underneath the back of the barrel for elevation changes. But then they got into these wedges so that it was easier to fine tune your shot. But these were called smashers or carronades. When they were in use, you were cannonading. It's basically artillery. They would shoot up in the air They could also use exploding shells, and they caused crazy damage. The exploding shells were full of musket balls, hundreds of them, and they could clear an entire deck with one shot. Very destructive. Only the US and the British used them, the French did not. This is the gun deck. You can see those giant 24-pound guns, and then the hatch going lower right in front here. So below this would be the mess deck. Uh, on smaller ships, your mess tables would be between your guns. But on this one, it was big enough you could have a separate mess deck. Now, I want you to look on the left of this picture. You see a barrel on its side with a square cut hole, right? That is called the scuttlebutt. The scuttle is the square cut hole. The butt is the name for that size barrel. It's a wine barrel measurement. So when someone says, oh, a buttload of something, they literally mean 105-gallon barrel. And as a unit of measurement, a butt. So the captain's cabin, obviously, it was very luxurious. Um, we couldn't go in, but you can see he had his dining space, his sleeping space, his quarter gallery, which is the shitter. Um, he had a pantry where his cook had a little tiny stove and would heat up his food, his toasted cheese, his coffee, his tea. Right? Now, it's really tough to tell, but every one of these walls is on a hinge. And when you go to quarters, you go into battle, all of these walls would swing up out of the way, leaving a clear sweep from bow to stern. And there would be guns inside the captain's cabin that would need to be served by the sailors. All the walls, including the wardroom walls for the other officers, they all swung up out of the way. All the furniture would go down to the orlop deck through a hatch on the ground and then brought back up. Now, that ship would go to quarters every morning just before dawn because you didn't know what the dawn was going to bring. There could be an enemy warship just a cable's distance off. A cable's 100 yards. Um, and you could wake up and the sun would, illuminate them right next to you. So you had to be at quarters when the sun came up, and then they'd put the ship back together. This is a 24-pounder gun. A funny story, these are not the original guns. After 300 years, they kind of rust away, and they still fire these guns. Every year they go and salute the fort. It's really tough to tell, but that is a British crest on the top of the gun. The foundry that created these replacement guns for the ship during its 1907 restoration just got it wrong. And at $20,000 each, uh, no one was going to spend the money to uh, cast 44 more of them. So they just left it. It was not unusual to have British guns on an American ship because American foundries were in their infancy, and so they would take what they could get. The USS Constitution fought 33 naval battles, and it never lost. It has a record of 33 to 0. This is called a capstan, right? It's basically a winch. Down at the bottom, you see that iron bar. It's called a pawl. And as this thing would spin, that would lock into these notches so that it couldn't spin backwards. Now, the staircase on either side, that's for tourists. Those would be removed um, or just be hatches in the floor. But in use, there's large wooden bars mounted in the ceilings that slide into the slots on the capstan. And the sailors would then put their chest against them and turn the capstan to bring in the anchor. Now, the anchor rope did not wind around the capstan. It goes actually down to the lower deck in the cable tier. So it was attached to a loop of rope going through a pulley. And then the anchor rope was tied to that loop. And then you would turn the capstan, it would pull on the anchor rope, and as the ties got near um, the capstan, the young ship's boys would untie them and then run to the new piece of rope that just came into the ship and tie it on again, so that the rope was a loop always being turned by the capstan, slowly pulling in the anchor rope, which was being tied and untied as they went along. It's called nipping, and the ship's boys were then called nippers, and that was the nickname that they got. And when they got a little older, hit 12 and became midshipmen, they became squeakers because their voice was changing. The ship's boys would also carry powder up from the magazine to the gun crews of the guns. But the capstan could also be used for um, hauling in an anchor. It could be used for hauling in boats. It could be used for hauling boats out of the water onto the davits. Any kind of winching. That's why you couldn't have a rope wrapped around it because then the capstan was useless. So they had to make sure that they could use the capstan, but always be able to use it for something else. That's why they would tie ropes to a rope and then untie them. Plus, the anchor rope comes in fouled with mud and seaweed, and it goes directly into its cable tier. You don't want that rotting against your capstan. This is the chain pump. It goes down into the bilge with leather baffles, and leather hoses would then be connected to these outlets. And this is how you pump the water out of the ship. You'd also use it to pump water onto the decks in the morning to holystone. The holystone is an abrasive brick. The sailors would scrub the wood decks with the abrasive brick to get rid of blood stains and tar and pitch and oakum that had worked its way out of the seams. It basically rocks back and forth, pumping water. This is an officer's cabin in the wardroom. So instead of a hammock, they used what was called a hanging cot. It was a wooden box with a mattress, and it would swing back and forth with the ship for a much better night's sleep. Now, I want you to notice the diagonal brace in the back of this cabin. That is part of those diagonal braces I talked about that would stop the hugging of the ship, right? Now, that big vertical brace next to it, that is called a knee, right? The knees would attach the sides of the ship to the deck beams of the ship to keep the sides from collapsing inward under fire, keeps the ship rigid. These are knees from the top side, whereas the last one you saw was from the bottom side. They were substantial. And again, we have those diagonal braces keeping the ship square and straight. There's actually a forest of live oak used to repair the Constitution. The standard practice of the day was to steam boards and bend them to fit the contours of a ship, but that puts them under tension, and if you bang them hard enough, they want to spring, and that's called springing a leak. Whereas to build the American frigates, they went to Georgia and they found trees, live oak trees that were shaped, they grew in the exact same shape that they needed to build the ship, and that made the ship far stronger. During its first battle in 1812 against the Guerriere, the 12-pound cannonballs, or 12-pound balls from the Guerriere, were bouncing off the sides of the Constitution, and one of the sailors cried, "Huzzah! Her sides are made of iron," and that is how she got the nickname Old Ironsides. On the mess deck here is where the sailors would swing all of their hammocks. You got 18 inches. Everyone got 18 inches. There was an upper row and a lower row. So you had someone right above you, and you were touching arms on each side with someone. This is the transom of the ship, the very back. This is what's called the relieving tackle. So the ship had a tiller, a rudder, and these ropes would be controlled by the wheel up top, and it would pull this tiller back and forth, steering the ship. Now, if your ship wheel was shut away, then you would send sailors down, and they would manually haul on these ropes, and so you're relieving the tackle. So it's the relieving tackle of the ship and your emergency steering. These long curved poles hanging off the side, they're also in the rear. Those are the ship's davits. They would swing out and you would winch boats up out of the water. There's many kinds of boats. You had your jolly boats, your barge, your pinnace, your cutter. They all had different purposes. They all held between 6 and 20 men. It's how you would board other ships. It's how you got stores from shore. It's how the captain would go visit the admiral. So you, depending on what you needed, you have different sized ships. Now I want you to notice the bulbous windows sticking off the back of the ship. As part of the captain's cabin. That is called the quarter gallery. There's a hole in the bottom of it, and that's where your captain would go to shit in private. Here's our stern. You can see our name, the Constitution, and those portholes go into the captain's cabin. You could also push guns out these holes in the back. They were called chase guns. And up front, we had stern chasers, so you could fire forward against a ship that you were chasing, and you could swing guns around and fire against someone who was chasing you. And this is Boston as I was leaving, my last view of Boston, walking across the bridge back to the train station before I realized I had lost my middle car key. But that is the Freedom Trail 2026. Next time you are in Boston, I highly recommend it.